constitutional recognition. As I mentioned earlier, I will develop and bring forward a consensus option for constitutional recognition to put to a referendum during the current parliamentary term. And that means working through until we reach a point in which there is consensus across all the relevant groups that have a stake in this. I do not want to proceed if we are not going to be successful. I have commenced the process of engaging and seeking the counsel of Indigenous leaders on the best way forward. We need to design the right model to progress to a point at which the majority of Australians, the majority of states and territories and Indigenous Australians support the model so that it is successful. The Morrison government is committed to recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution and working to achieve this through a process of true co-design. Constitutional recognition is too important, and I don't want to rush it, because when I consider the successful 1967 referendum, it was a result of tireless advocacy and an extraordinary nationwide momentum for change. If we want to see that kind of national consensus again, we need to be thorough and we need to take time to get it right. We have allocated $7.3 million for a co-design process to improve local and regional decision-making, and an additional $160 million has been set aside for a future referendum once the model has been determined. I plan to establish a working group of parliamentary colleagues of all political persuasions to assist me in considering the role of engaging on the many levels to bring forward a community model. The Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Linda Burney, will be integral to that process. The constitutional recognition work is unfinished. It will take time, it will need to be measured, and I would certainly ask for media to play its part in influencing conversations that we need to have around kitchen tables and at barbecues. In truth-telling, I will work on approaches to progressing how we address truth-telling. Without the truth of the past, there can be no agreement on where or who we are in the present, how we arrived here, and where we want to go in the future. A truth-telling process that allows all Australians to reflect on the place of First Nations people and our shared past has to happen at the national, state and local levels right across this country. History is generally written from a dominant society's point of view and not that of the suppressed, and therefore true history is brushed aside, masked, dismissed and in some instances destroyed. In recent years, we have seen more open acknowledgement as more evidence emerges of the brutal realities of the past. We need to know what happened to the children raised on missions and in foster homes and their parents, to see the lasting effect on the way people move through the world decades later. It's now 22 years since the Bringing Them Home report opened the records of child removals and showed people for the first time what happened to Aboriginal families in this country. We need to hear of the lies that were told, the casual cruelty of the fates they were dealt, and the unthinkable loss in their hearts. Opening those records was painful for all of us, but it was necessary. It opened hearts and minds. It opened up space in our collective life for understanding, healing and forgiveness. That's what truth does. It sets you free. Only when we tell the truth and when we are willing to listen to the truth can we find common ground to walk on. Only then can we begin to trust each other and to walk together side by side. Treaty. With respect to treaty, it's important that states and territory jurisdictions take the lead. When you consider the Constitution, they are better placed to undertake that work. The West Australian Yungar Land Agreement, implemented by the Barnett government, is a treaty in the true sense. Treaty models are now evolving, with work being undertaken by the Victorian and Northern Territory governments, which address the aspirations of Indigenous Australians in those jurisdictions. And it's important that it resides and sits there. Closing the gap. The Prime Minister has charged me with delivering a revised Closing the Gaps target that drive improved outcomes for Indigenous Australians through the Closing the Gap refresh process and arrangements. In December 2018, COAG agreed to build its relationship with Indigenous Australians, and the Coalition has overseen the first ever formal agreement between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations, the federal government and states and territories. This will have profound impacts as we move to the implementation of the Council of Australian Governments Closing the Gap Partnership Agreement. We will continue to work on closing the gap between the outcomes in health, the mortality and the life expectancy. We'll focus on education, jobs and economic security and other aspects of wellbeing. A diverse and disparate geography shapes effective service delivery as government providers and businesses navigate the diversity of the urban, regional and more than 2,000 remote communities and towns. And I want to share with you a phone call that was made to someone I know who was asked to fly to the Nunajara lands, have their plane land at the airport, call a taxi and do a surprise visit on an aged care facility. Now, any of you who know the Nunajara lands know there is no telephone. You have to buzz over the community with a small flight and then land and wait for someone to come and pick you up. So there's no element of surprise. But the point I'm making is our geographic diversity is a challenge, and there is much that we will need to seriously consider as we do this. In this setting, we are committed to expanding regional models that give Indigenous Australians a real say on issues that affect them and drive local solutions for improved outcomes. First Australians regularly state that Indigenous organisations deliver stronger outcomes for their people through cultural competence, engagement and community confidence. But equally, we need to ensure Indigenous Australians who choose to use other services, including mainstream services, are a priority of our government. Since March